You can still hear the scrape of the chair legs against the linoleum, the soft thud of the casserole dish landing on the trivet, your mother's voice calling from the kitchen doorway that dinner's ready. And you came, not because you were summoned by a text message or a second reminder, but because that's just what you did. 6 o'clock, sometimes 5:30, sometimes closer to 7, depending on your father's shift, but every night your family gathered around the same table in the same chairs, and for the next 30 or 40 minutes you talked. Not about anything earth-shattering, not about politics and the way we think of them now, not about existential questions or carefully curated opinions designed for an audience. You talked about the day, about small things, about nothing and everything. And somehow, in the talking, you became a family. Your father would settle into his chair, the one that was his, that no one else sat in even when he wasn't home, and he'd unfold his napkin with a sigh that meant the workday was finally over. Your mother would pass the green beans, still steaming, and someone would say grace or someone wouldn't, depending on your household, and then the conversation would begin. It started the same way almost every night. How was school? How was work? Did anything happen today? And your father would talk about the job, not in the language of LinkedIn or performance reviews, but in the plain, worn-down vocabulary of a man who'd spent 8 or 9 hours doing something and wanted to set it down for a while. He'd mention a coworker's name, Jerry or Stan or Mr. Peterson from the front office, and he'd tell a story about something that went wrong with a machine or a shipment that came in late or the way the boss had been in a mood all afternoon. Your mother would nod, ask a clarifying question, and you'd learn, without realizing you were learning, what working meant. Not as an abstract concept, but as a thing people did, day after day, and then came home from. Sometimes your father's stories carried weight. He'd mention that the plant might be cutting hours, or that there was talk of layoffs, and the table would go quieter. Your mother's face would shift almost imperceptibly, and you'd sense, even as a child, that this was serious. Other times his stories were lighter. Pranks pulled by coworkers, a funny exchange with a customer, the ridiculous memo that came down from management. You'd watch your mother's shoulders relax, see her smile, understand that if Dad could laugh about work, things were probably okay. Your mother's updates were different. They carried the texture of the neighborhood, the grocery store, the doctor's office, the beauty parlor. She'd tell your father that Mrs. Callahan's son got accepted to college, or that the Hendersons were putting in a new driveway, or that ground beef was on sale this week so she'd picked up extra for the freezer. She'd mention running into someone at the A&P, and there'd be a whole subplot about what that person said and how they looked and whether they seemed well. These weren't gossip sessions, exactly, though sometimes they brushed up against it. They were status reports, updates on the ecosystem of people and places that made up your world. And you listened, even when you pretended not to, and you learned who mattered, how people were connected, what it meant to keep track of a community. She'd talk about phone calls she'd received during the day. Your aunt had called to say she'd found a dress for the wedding. The dentist's office had called to confirm your appointment next week. A neighbor had called asking to borrow the hedge trimmer. Each call was an event worth mentioning because there weren't dozens of them. The phone rang maybe 3 or 4 times a day, and each ring meant something, connected to someone, required a response or a follow-up, or at least acknowledgement at dinner. Then it was your turn. Your mother would look at you, or your father would, and they'd ask about school. And you'd have to come up with something. You couldn't say fine and leave it there, not every night anyway. So you'd mention a test or a project or the fact that your teacher had been in a bad mood and kept everyone inside for recess. You'd talk about your friends, about who said what at lunch, about the kid who got sent to the principal's office. If your grades were good, you'd hear praise. If they weren't, you'd hear concern and maybe a plan and maybe a consequence. The report card wasn't a private document between you and a parent portal. It was a physical piece of cardstock that got brought to the table, examined, discussed, signed. Your performance in school wasn't an abstraction. It was dinner conversation. Your parents asked specific questions, not just how was school, but did you finish that book report? And what did Mrs. Anderson say about your science project? And are you still having trouble with that boy who was bothering you last week? They remembered the details you'd mentioned before. They followed up. And sometimes that felt intrusive, like they were paying too much attention. But mostly it felt like they cared. Like your world, even the boring parts, mattered enough to ask about. If you had siblings, they'd get their turn too. And you'd half listen, half argue, half ignore them while you finished your peas or reached for another roll. Your little brother would talk about his baseball game, and your father would ask specific questions. Did you get a hit? What position did you play? Did Coach Martinez say anything? Your sister would mention her piano lesson, or the fact that her best friend wasn't talking to her anymore, and your mother would gently probe, trying to figure out if this was serious or just the usual turbulence of girlhood friendships. And sometimes the conversation would spiral into an argument. Someone would say something that annoyed someone else, and voices would rise, and your mother would say, "That's enough," and your father would give a look that meant it, and the argument would subside into sullen chewing. But even the arguments were part of it. You were learning how to disagree, how to take turns, how to read a room. There were recurring topics, rituals within the ritual. The weekend plans always came up by Thursday. Where are we going Saturday? Are we visiting Grandma? Is Dad working overtime? Can I sleep over at Kevin's house? Can we go to the lake? These weren't text threads or shared calendars. They were negotiations conducted in real time, with everyone present, so that by the time dessert came around, you knew what the weekend would look like. And if plans changed, you'd hear about it at the next night's dinner. Your father might come home Friday and announce that he had to work Saturday after all, and there'd be disappointment, maybe some frustration, but everyone adjusted because that's how it worked. Plans were fluid, contingent on the immediate realities of work and whether the car was running right. Money came up, but carefully. Not the details. Your parents didn't break down the mortgage payment or the electric bill in front of you, but the edges of it. Your mother might mention that she'd put something back at the store because it was too expensive, or your father might say that overtime was available next week and he'd probably take it. You'd ask for something, a new bike, a toy you saw at the store, money for the movies, and the answer would come with context. We'll see. Maybe for your birthday. Not right now. That's not in the budget this month. You learned that money was finite, that it required thought, that wanting something didn't mean getting it. No one sat you down for a formal lesson in delayed gratification. You absorbed it across 1,000 dinner tables. Sometimes your parents would discuss a major purchase, whether to replace the washing machine now or wait another year, whether the car would make it through another winter, whether to put in that new fence or save the money for something else. You weren't asked to vote, but you were present for the thinking out loud that adults did when they were trying to make a decision. You learned that grown-ups didn't always have clear answers, that they weighed options, that sometimes they disagreed and had to work it out. The news came up, but not the way it does now. Your father might mention something he'd heard on the radio on the drive home, or your mother might bring up a story from the evening paper that was still folded next to her plate. A fire across town, a new stoplight going in at the intersection near the school, something happening at the state level that might affect your father's plant. The news was local, concrete, and it didn't arrive in an endless scroll. It didn't dominate the meal. It was one thread among many, something to chew on briefly before moving on to dessert. Occasionally, something bigger would come up, a presidential election, a major event, something happening overseas. Your parents might talk about it in careful language, aware that you were listening, but not entirely sure how much to say. If it was the 60s or early 70s, Vietnam might hang in the air, mentioned obliquely or not at all, depending on whether your family had skin in that particular game. If it was later, it might be the economy, inflation, the price of gas. But even then, the conversation stayed tethered to what it meant for your family, your town, your life. The abstract was always brought back to the concrete. Family logistics wove through everything. Your aunt and uncle were coming to visit in 2 weeks, and your mother needed to figure out where everyone would sleep. Your cousin was getting married in the fall, and there was talk of what to wear, whether you'd all drive together, whether you'd stay overnight. Thanksgiving plans started getting mentioned in October. Christmas came up before Halloween was over. Your family operated on a long horizon of small coordinations, and the dinner table was mission control. You'd hear about relatives you barely knew, your father's brother who lived 2 states away and was having trouble with his back, your mother's cousin who just had another baby, grandma's health, whether she was doing okay living alone, whether she'd agreed to move closer. These people existed in your mental map because they were mentioned at dinner, their lives narrated in brief updates that kept the family web intact, even across distance. And then there were the stories. Your father had a rotating set of them, stories from his own childhood, stories about his time in the service, if he'd served, stories about the early days of his marriage, back when money was even tighter and your mother was pregnant with your older sibling and they lived in a tiny apartment near the rail yard. He'd tell them the same way every time, with the same pauses and the same punchlines. And you'd groan because you'd heard it before, but secretly you didn't mind. The repetition was comforting. It meant you knew where you came from. Your mother had her stories too, about growing up during the Depression or the war, or just in a time when things were different. She'd talk about walking to school in the snow, yes, really, actually uphill, or about her own mother's cooking, or the time she met your father and knew right away, or didn't know at all and had to be convinced. These stories weren't told as formal lessons. They'd emerge naturally, triggered by something someone said, and they'd last 3 or 4 minutes, and then dinner would move on. But within those stories were values, quietly transmitted. Your father's story about walking 5 miles to return a wallet he'd found taught you about honesty without ever using the word. Your mother's story about her mother making do during hard times taught you about resilience. The story about your grandfather standing up to a bully taught you about courage. You weren't sitting through a moral instruction session. You were just hearing about the people you came from, and in the hearing, you learned what mattered. Sometimes the conversation would hit a lull. You'd all be chewing, and there'd be nothing urgent to say, and the silence would settle over the table like a blanket. And that was okay. No one rushed to fill it with noise. Your mother would ask if anyone wanted seconds. Your father would reach for the salt. The clock on the wall would tick. The dog would sigh under the table. You'd hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing outside, the settling sounds of the house around you. And then someone would think of something, and the conversation would pick back up, easy and unhurried. The television stayed off. That was the rule, spoken or unspoken. Dinner was family time, and the TV could wait. If there was a show someone wanted to watch, it came up in conversation. Did you remember to tell Dad that his program was on tonight at 8? But it didn't intrude on the meal itself. The radio might be playing softly in the background in some houses, a low murmur of music or news, but the focus was each other. Not in a formal, we're practicing mindfulness kind of way, just in the ordinary way of people who didn't have 100 other places their attention could go. There was teaching happening, though no one called it that. You learned how to hold a fork properly because your mother corrected you when you didn't. You learned not to talk with your mouth full because your father looked at you a certain way. You learned to wait your turn, to listen when someone else was speaking, to ask follow-up questions, to gauge when a topic was serious and when it was light. You learned the architecture of a conversation, how it moved, how it breathed, how it held people together. You learned to read faces and voices. When your father's voice had a certain edge, you knew not to push. When your mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, you knew something was bothering her even if she didn't say what. When your sibling went quiet, you knew they were upset about something. These were the social skills that no one explicitly taught, but that you picked up through sheer proximity, night after night around the same table. You also learned your family's values, not because anyone delivered a lecture, but because you heard what they cared about. If your father talked with pride about a coworker who'd been with the company for 30 years, you learned that loyalty mattered. If your mother expressed concern about a neighbor who was struggling, you learned that people looked out for each other. If your parents debated whether to spend money on something or save it, you learned that choices had weight. The dinner table was where the family's moral world got transmitted, one offhand comment at a time. And it wasn't perfect. Some nights were tense. Your parents might be frustrated with each other, and you'd feel it in the clipped responses, the careful politeness that meant they'd talk about it later, after you were in bed. Some nights you were in trouble, and the meal was uncomfortable, and you ate quickly and asked to be excused. Some nights your siblings annoyed you so much you could barely stand to sit across from them. Some nights the conversation felt boring, repetitive, like you'd heard all these stories and updates 100 times before and couldn't wait to leave the table. But you still sat. You still showed up, because that's what you did. And in the showing up, in the repetition, something accumulated, a sense of belonging, a knowledge of your people, an understanding that you were part of something that existed before you and would continue after you left for college or got married or moved across the country. When dinner was over, the table didn't just empty. There was the clearing, the scraping of plates, the running of water in the sink. Sometimes you helped, sometimes you didn't, depending on the household rules and your age and whether you were trying to dodge the dishes. Your father might retreat to his chair in the living room with the paper. Your mother might start the washing up. You might have homework, or permission to go outside until dark, or a show you were allowed to watch. But for those 30 or 40 minutes, you'd all been in the same place, talking about the same things, building the invisible architecture that held your family together. Now, dinner is different. Schedules don't line up the way they used to. One person eats at 5, another at 7, another grabs something on the way home. Phones sit on the table, buzzing and glowing, pulling attention in a dozen directions. Meals are faster, quieter, more efficient. And when families do gather, the conversation often competes with screens, with notifications, with the feeling that there's always somewhere else you could be, something else you could be checking. The topics haven't disappeared. People still have work days and school days and weekend plans and family logistics to discuss. But the container has fractured. The daily ritual that forced everyone into the same room at the same time has become optional, negotiable, something that happens when it's convenient, rather than something that simply happens. But the need hasn't changed. The need to sit together, to hear each other's voices, to learn the small details of each other's days, the need to feel like you belong to something, to people who know you and notice you and care what happened at work or school or in the mundane errands of an ordinary afternoon. The need to tell stories, to pass down values, to teach without teaching, to build connection through the simple act of being present. You can't recreate 1968. You can't bring back the casserole dishes and the rotary phones and the world where 6 o'clock meant everyone was home. But you can bring back the habit. You can turn off the TV. You can set the phones in another room, face down, on silent. You can say, for this half hour, we're here together. You can ask, how was your day? And actually wait for the answer, even if the answer is boring or repetitive or something you've heard before. You can tell stories. You can ask follow-up questions. You can let your children hear you think out loud about adult decisions. You can share the small details of your own day, not the curated highlights, but the ordinary texture of living. You can let the silence be comfortable when it comes. You can let the conversation meander. You can make the table, whatever table you have, a place where people come back together every night or as often as you can manage, and remember what it feels like to be a family that talks. Because the topics weren't extraordinary. The topics were ordinary, small, forgettable on their own. Ground beef on sale, a coworker's bad mood, a homework assignment, plans for Saturday, the neighbor's new driveway. But together, across years, they built something solid, something you carry with you still. The sound of your mother's voice asking about school, your father's stories, your siblings' laugh, the scrape of a chair, the quiet that meant you were all full, all together, all home. That's what you talked about at the dinner table. Everything, nothing, the small pieces that made a life. And in the talking, you built something that no technology can replicate and no convenience can replace. The knowledge that you belonged, that someone was listening, that your ordinary day mattered enough to share.